Did the Exodus happen? And I am thrilled to have two heavyweight champs in the debate world to engage this important topic. CJ Cox from the Synagogue and Grayson from the Based Theory YouTube channel. And so it's a privilege to have you both here for our first official formal debate on the Exodus. And so why don't we get acquainted and break the ice a little bit before we get into our opening statements for tonight. Grayson, let's start with you. Firstly, how you doing tonight? A little bit about yourself and also a little bit about your channel.
Yep. Hey, everybody. I'm Grayson. YouTube channel is Based Theory. You can just type in Based Theory on YouTube and you can watch all the debates that I have up there. I've been arguing about a lot of topics that I would consider pseudoscience, from young earth creationism to the flat earth to geocentrism. But today we're going to get into a little bit less pseudoscience, more pseudo-history with the Exodus. So my position, just to be clear, is that the Exodus did not happen exactly as it's described in the Bible. It can be some kind of kernel of truth for some kind of real event that maybe inspired it or based upon it. But in terms of the historicity of the text, I will be arguing against that position. And I think it is totally fine. You can still be Christian and not agree that the Exodus was a real event that happened in history. You can still admire the spiritual truth or the wisdoms or the meaning in Exodus without acknowledging it as a real historical event that happened. And you can still be Christian. In fact, a lot of Jewish people in Israel today and a lot of modern Christians don't accept the historicity of the Exodus, and they're still Jewish and still Christian. So that's my position.
Grayson, thank you very much for that introduction. Great to have you back. I do have your channel linked in the description box for people to check out. Okay, CJ from the Synagogue YouTube channel, good to have you as well. Just had you here about a week ago for a debate on the problem of evil with John Crawford. Certainly an excellent debate for people to check out. So CJ, how you doing tonight? A little bit about yourself and also a little bit about the Synagogue.
Yeah, so my name is TJ Cox, as he said, and I run the YouTube channel The Synagogue, where we do discussions on, a whole bunch of apologetics and theology things from a Reformed fundamentalist perspective, typically discussing Calvinism or objections from atheists, but we'll also sometimes go into objections that come from people in other theological camps, like different views on the law of Moses. And we used to talk about things like cessationism and stuff like that, but it's really been a while, actually. Holidays, history, stuff like that. A lot of an eclectic mix, so to speak, there. But yeah, that's basically all that we have going on there. I do a video blog, I do a podcast called Unapologetics, and I'll sometimes post little clips. I have a lot of debates and discussions / interviews that we host there as well. And I also am not critically acclaimed, but nevertheless am an author of a book titled 15 Questions for Calvinists Answered, which is completely irrelevant to this conversation, but nevertheless is something that I've gotten published recently there. So that's a little bit about me. I've discussed this topic twice now, kind of. One time, this explicit topic over at, I think, what channel were we on? Pretty sure it was Myth Vision. And it was me and a gentleman named Jonathan Sheffield discussing with Dr. Josh Bowen and Dr. Maggie something or other. I'm sorry, Maggie. I can't remember your last name. And also I discussed whether or not Moses existed on Modern Day Debate with Dr. Jim Majors, which is kind of ridiculous, to be honest with you, because I'm a high school dropout who's discussed this with PhD historians in their own field. But nevertheless, the Lord has been good to me. So this will be my third debate on this issue, and I'm very pleased to have it up. And I thank you for hosting it, and I thank you, Grayson, for having this conversation with me.
My pleasure, CJ. It's about time we got CJ Cox and Grayson in the debate octagon to bring the heat, and I think this is the perfect topic for the two of you to engage. Again, to the audience, anybody just joining us, this is the Great Exodus Debate. The question we are engaging tonight: did the Exodus happen? Of course, CJ taking the affirmative and Grayson taking the negative. If you like what you're hearing from our guests, Grayson and CJ, do please check the description box for links to their YouTube channels. And so format-wise for tonight, we are going to have lots of open discussion time to engage the points and ask each other questions relevant to Exodus. And so we are going to be having 15-minute openings. CJ will present his positive case for tonight for about 15 minutes. Grayson will get 15 minutes to respond. And then we'll jump right into an open discussion where we can, it'll be more free flowing rather than strictly cross exam. And then we'll jump into some audience questions. So please, to you in the audience, if you do have a question for CJ or a question for Grayson, just let me know who it's for. Tag me at Standing for Truth or at Donnie, and we'll have a solid audience Q&A as we usually do. Okay, let's get right into it with CJ Cox, your 15-minute opening statement. Gentlemen, I'll give you a 2-minute warning when you hit the 13-minute mark, just to let you know to start winding things down. So CJ, let me know when you're ready, and I'll start your timer.
Ready, thank you. So, Shalom Saints, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I'd like to thank Grayson, a mixed base theory in Grayson. Grayson for having this conversation with me today, as well as the audience for their participation in listening. And of course, I want to give thanks to Donnie for hosting this debate for us. Of course, couldn't be doing it without his help, so I appreciate that very much. Our thesis question today is, did the Exodus happen? Or the Great Exodus Debate is the way it's titled here. But of course, we're asking the question, did the Exodus happen? And I am going to be taking the affirmative, saying that I believe the Exodus did actually happen. And of course, this is something that is incredibly important to all of us as believers, being that it is portrayed as a historical event in the scriptures. So hopefully I am able to do a good job with that. For the sake of the debate, I am not going to be arguing that the Bible necessarily recorded this infallibly. I believe the Bible recorded this event infallibly, but I don't think taking a positive position on biblical infallibility is necessary in order to defend the historicity of the Exodus in this debate. I'll be making the case later. There are numerous events we accept as having happened, and even historical resources we accept as having either predominantly good value or at least some good historical value, without accepting that they are necessarily infallible, right? So we'll get into that, of course, but I just want to be clear. If somebody were to raise an objection, well, this detail may or may not be wrong. Well, I'm not necessarily defending the details here. I think that's another conversation, one which would be good to have, maybe not in a debate format, but more informal. I'm simply defending the historicity of the event, which of course means we need to define a couple minimum requirements to say this event took place and not some event that's sort of related to it, but not quite the same thing. So in order for us to say the Exodus took place, I think we would have to agree on a couple of minimum facts. Number one, the Hebrews specifically will have to have been enslaved in Egypt. Now, of course, they don't have to be exclusively enslaved in Egypt. In other words, there can be other slave groups, even potentially other Semitic slave groups. But a distinct culture that we can call Hebrew must have been enslaved in Egypt, or at least in a distinct culture that appears to us to be Hebrew. Maybe we won't be able to demonstrate it infallibly, but if we can set up enough evidence to say, okay, the best possible conclusion is that these guys are Hebrew, that would be, I think, sufficient as well. But it's got to be Hebrew Semites, right? Not just general groups of people enslaved, not even just generally Semites enslaved. I think we should certainly be saying that Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt in order for this to be true, okay? Second thing that needs to be true in order for us to say the Exodus happened is there, of course, needs to be a mass exodus, right? There needs to be not just a trickling down, some people left and then some other people left and then some other people left, but rather a mass event in which a bunch of people at once left Egypt, led by some kind of a leader, which gets me to my third point. There has to be some historical Moses, some lawgiver figure who led the Hebrews out of the Exodus, or out of Egypt, rather, out of slavery, likely considered to be a prophet. In fact, I would say necessarily considered to be a prophet. And we could even add born in the Pharaoh's house there as well, because that is certainly a pretty important detail. They need to have wandered for a period of time at least resembling 40 years. Some might say that the 40 years is a euphemism. I'm not necessarily here to defend that, but nevertheless, whatever that 40 years means, they certainly need to be wandering for an amount of time in the Arabian desert that corresponds to 40 years. And I would say, fifthly, that there needs to be a conquest of Canaan, which is kind of an adjacent issue, but it is incredibly important to the topic. And I feel like I'm actually missing one, but I'm sure Grayson will remind me, because we discussed our points as far as what constitutes the Exodus being something that happened, right? The minimum facts we'd have to agree on. So what kind of evidence do we have to say that these minimum facts did actually take place, or are actually facts and are not opinions or something like that? I'm wording this terribly. I apologize. So the first argument I would have is what I would call the argument from the Bible. Now, I want to be clear here. This is not a religious argument from the Bible. In other words, I'm not saying the Bible is the revealed word of God and it says, therefore. Of course, as a believer, I affirm that the Bible is the revealed word of God, and it does say, and so therefore. But of course, if I'm talking to somebody who is not a believer, that argument does not suffice. So for those of you who agree with me that the Bible is indeed the word of God, that might be a perfectly valid argument. But for those who don't agree with me that the Bible is the word of God, then that would not actually be a valid argument. So then what do I mean? What I mean is that the Bible is an incredibly old text, which finds within its pages the history of the Israelite people in an era that either is contemporary, if you believe conservative scholars, Moses wrote the Torah, or is at least incredibly old, the oldest known documentation of Hebrews from the hand of Hebrews, right? In other words, even according to the modern secular historian, the Bible is the oldest text that Hebrews wrote about the history of Hebrews. There are, of course, Egyptian hieroglyphs and Assyrians and stuff like that, but nevertheless. So what we have here is an incredibly old document that in numerous places says this event took place. And this document, at best, was written by contemporaries, if Moses actually wrote the Torah, and at worst is the oldest historical document the Hebrews wrote themselves about themselves in modern history. In other words, that is extant, right? This history, as I will call it, has numerous different areas where it makes this claim, and these numerous different books, you should say, that make this claim, and these different books are not actually necessarily related to each other. Again, as a believer, we of course believe that Scripture is consistent with itself. But if we were taking our believing glasses off for a moment and just looking at it from a secular perspective, we could say, okay, the Torah is a different work than Hosea, different work than Isaiah, and even from a Christian perspective, that still kind of holds true. And yet, we see in the Torah, which is believed to be written sometime between 400 and 600 AD by secular historians, or sometime between 1200 and 1400 BC by conservatives who would take the Bible literally. The Torah, of course, mentions not only the fact that the Exodus happened, but even recounts the entire story of the Exodus. But beyond that, the secular historian will say that the oldest book of the Bible is probably something in the minor prophets, like the book of Hosea, which mentions the Exodus, or the book of Haggai, which mentions the Exodus, or the book of Obadiah, which I believe Obadiah is the one I'm thinking of. I might be misremembering that one, but nevertheless, it's one of the other minor prophets that also mentions the Exodus. So what we have here is not only the oldest known Hebrew text, the oldest, to be more specific, the oldest known text, which is written by Hebrews about Hebrews, explaining that this history did happen, but multiple different books within this text, which are not necessarily related to each other, make this claim, including the ones which the conservative scholar would say are the oldest, the Torah, and the ones which the secular scholar would say are the oldest, things like the minor prophets, Haggai and Hosea, and so on, right? We also see that the details are internally consistent, right? Which implies to me that the Hebrews had a set story, if you will. It's not constantly changing, right? When you have a myth, very often there are details that this writer writes this particular detail about the myth, and this writer writes this different disparate detail about the myth, right? And so on and so forth. And they often come into conflict with each other because each author is sort of adding their own literary flair to it because it's a myth. The different books of the Bible, on the other hand, are internally consistent, much like different history books would be internally consistent, right? Like if I read one book about the Civil War written by one author and another book written about the Civil War by another author, they should be, at least for the most part, consistent with each other. Why? Because they're describing a historical event, right? One might object to this particular claim by saying something along the lines of, well, 600,000 seems like too much, or I don't buy into the spiritual claims, or different sorts of things. We'll talk more about this in the back and forth, but I would just like to point out that very many resources which we use to look at ancient history also will have exaggerated claims and also will have claims of godhood and spirits and different supernatural things that the historian may not otherwise accept. For example, it is commonly accepted, not universally, but commonly accepted that the Trojan War did happen. That does not mean that people believe that the Trojan War was a fight over a golden apple that Aphrodite created, or that some other being created. I don't know the exact story, but and then Paris said, oh, the fairest of them all is Aphrodite, so that he could get his hands on the Queen Helen. Nobody is accepting that because they're accepting that the Trojan War actually took place, right? But for the most part, there seems to be a general consensus that the Trojan War actually took place. Another example, Ramesses will often call himself, in the various hieroglyphs that he has written down on the walls in Egypt, a deity of some kind, right? And he'll exaggerate his exploits. Like, for example, in the Battle of Kadesh, he seems to describe himself as the winner of the battle, and decisively so. But we have access to a peace treaty signed between him and the Hittites where it is revealed actually that was not the case, right? Does that mean we discount the hieroglyphs that Ramses had commissioned by his own decree as history? Of course, we do not, right? Third example, last one I'll use for now, the Battle of Thermopylae. Earliest recording of the Battle of Thermopylae is from Herodotus. Herodotus claims there was 1 million men who invaded, or who attacked the Spartans, rather, at Thermopylae. That number is universally rejected, and yet nobody rejects Herodotus as a source, and well, I shouldn't say nobody. Probably 95% of people don't reject Herodotus as a source, and actually nobody rejects that the Battle of Thermopylae took place, right? In other words, I can grant that there is exaggeration. Again, I don't believe it, granting it for the sake of argument. And I can grant that the spiritual elements of the Exodus may or may not have happened, and still believe the Exodus did take place. And again, I'm keeping it at that limited scope because I don't want to debate whether or not Moses actually was speaking to God. That's a different conversation. I want to debate specifically whether or not the Exodus event took place, right? We'll get more into that later. My second argument is what I would call an argument from tradition. Argument from tradition would be essentially there are certain traditional elements of Jewish culture, specifically ancient Israelite culture, which have their origin, according to the tradition, in the Exodus. If you're removing the Exodus event, it doesn't seem like we have a reason for these things to be taking place. For example, the most obvious is the Passover, right? During the Passover, you are commemorating the event that is the death of the firstborn, the ultimate leaving of Egypt. In other words, the Exodus, right? It's kind of a somber holiday. It's a celebration, but it's also kind of not a celebration in that it is remembering the fact that your children were not killed by a death angel, right? It's a relatively brutal kind of holiday. If the Exodus, of course, didn't happen, we would ask the question, why is there a Passover? The Passover seems to indicate that a celebration of some event that took place there on the calendar, much like July 4th is evidence that the signing of the Declaration of Independence did actually happen. Your birthday is evidence that you were born, right? So these events are commemorating certain events in history, thus giving us an indication those events may have taken place. It's not a scientific proof in the sense that it demonstrates it infallibly, but nevertheless, it is, I think, a
2 minutes.
evidence. Thank you, brother. Related to that, the calendar itself. The Israelites have two different calendars. They have one that starts in Tishrei. We are currently in that month on the Hebrew calendar. And they have one that starts in Aviv, otherwise known as Nisan. The one that starts in Tishrei lines up perfectly with every other Middle Eastern calendar of that time, right? The Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Hittites, etc. They all have a calendar that also starts around that August, September area. Why do the Hebrews have this second calendar that starts around the March and April area? Well, according to the tradition, it's because that's when they left Egypt, right? Now, every calendar starts where it starts for some reason, including our own today. It starts in January because that's what the Romans did. But nevertheless, if we're going to say this event didn't take place, now we have this piece of evidence that seems to just be existing in the ether. The fact that this calendar starts in the month of Aviv is evidence that there is a reason for that to take place. What's the reason? According to the tradition, it is that this Exodus took place. Another argument from tradition that I would want to mention is the Levites. The Levitical claim to the priesthood is grounded in the fact that Aaron and Moses are Levites, right? So in other words, again, the existence of a Levitical priesthood is a traditional evidence that this event may have taken place, because that's the very foundation for them but being the priestly caste over the Israelites in that ancient time. The other two arguments are the ones which I'm very glad I don't have much time to talk about, only because I have a feeling they're the ones that are going to be most discussed, right? These are arguments from history. Josephus, Manetho, the Talmud, and etc. all claim this event took place. There is no historical record outside of the Bible that is denying this. They tried to find different ways of explaining it, and sometimes they're just telling us, hey, this is the event that took place. That does seem to indicate that it did take place. And then arguments from archaeology. We do have evidence. Thank you, brother. We do have evidence of Semitic names in Egypt. We have evidence of a conquest of Canaan, and so on and so forth. So that's where I would end with that. I hope that those arguments are at least somewhat persuasive, and I don't have any time to yield, but I yielded anyway.
Okay, CJ, I know 15 minutes flies by when you're in the middle of an opening statement. So CJ, appreciate the 15-minute opening statement to the audience. I am all caught up on your questions that you are already sending in, so I do appreciate it. Grayson, we're now going to hand it over to you for a 15-minute response. And so when you're ready, let me know. Floor is yours.
All right, great. Well, this is the first time on this channel that I've made a PowerPoint for my presentation, so I'd like to share that.
All right, here we go.
Okay, cool. Well, to start with, I just want to point out these two evidences here to less so address what CJ was talking about, but to address a very common misconception perpetuated in the documentary, The Patterns of Exodus, where they say that, oh, the Egyptian chronology is wrong, and that's why the dates for Exodus don't line up and don't fit with the actual data in archaeology. So these two, the Amarna letters and the Uluburun shipwreck, completely debunk patterns of evidence. Like, it cannot coexist with these two evidences right here. So the Amarna letters are a series of letters, over 300 letters that we actually have preserved in the archaeological record between the Pharaoh, Akhenaten, and you see all of these different territories on the map right here on the left. There were correspondences between the leaders of all of these different territories and the Pharaoh. We actually have the actual words that they said to each other in those letters. So I'm going to be using those letters as evidence as well. But this allows us to date the reign of Akhenaten in the 14th century BC, the 1360 to 1332. This allows us to date this compared to all of the rest of the region in the Middle East, the Levant, the Mediterranean. We can contemporaneously date all of these because of the Amarna letters. The Uluburun shipwreck is similar. It's a shipwreck in the Mediterranean full of goods from all over the Mediterranean, so many different societies, including Egyptian. And there are three independent methods that all give almost the same date of 1320 BC, plus or minus about 15 years. So radiocarbon dating of the ship, dendrochronology, which is the tree rings on the ship, both converge on a very similar date. And then there's a scarab from Nefertiti on board, who was the wife of Akhenaten. So this shipwreck could not have sunk before Nefertiti. So this is what allows us to know that the reigns of Akhenaten and Nefertiti were in this range in the 1300s BC. So that alone debunks the entire argument in Patterns of Exodus for trying to move around the Egyptian chronology. But I think CJ largely agrees, or at least agrees for the sake of argument, with the common consensus dates in Egyptian chronology. One other thing that I would just like to address is people talk about like chariots found in the Red Sea. Those are all fake news. I'm sorry if you've seen that and you wanted to believe it, so you believed it. But no, there haven't been any Egyptian chariots found in the Red Sea or in the Arabian Peninsula or whatever. That's all fake news. I'm sorry if you fell victim to it. Look it up. There's no serious archaeological evidence for any large amount or even small amount of chariots found in the Red Sea or anywhere near the area where the Exodus army would have, like Pharaoh's army, would have been wiped out by the Red Sea. So those are just some common misconceptions. Let's move on. Here's an excellent book, Israel's Ethnogenesis by Abraham Faust. He's an excellent Egyptian archaeologist. In this book, he really analyzes like over 1,000 archaeological sites throughout Israel to construct a picture of where the Israelite ethnicity originated, and it is local. It is coming from Canaanite society. We don't see any evidence that the Israelites were some sort of external group that migrated into the region. And when we analyze the thousands of archaeological sites, because you have to remember, Israel is one of the most dug up places on earth, like one of the areas where we know the most about it archaeologically. I mean, we've had hundreds of years of Christian archaeologists very, very interested in this region, going to it to try to prove the Exodus. They have been looking for evidence for the Exodus for hundreds of years, and they haven't found any. So this guy has compiled from both his own excavations as well as just compiling in the field. I would highly recommend this book, Israel's Ethnogenesis. It goes through, it supports all of its claims with evidence, showing how the Israelite ethnicity originated in Canaan from Canaanite cultures. We see a very clear, like slow, gradual development of the Israelite, the Hebrew culture within Canaan. Like you see piecemeal, like one piece at a time, the Canaanite material culture becomes the Israelite material culture, and we can see it step by step in the archaeological record. It's not a big mystery. Here's something else, because one of the points was that there was some pre-existing Hebrew culture, and I've seen people like bring this up. It was in Patterns of Exodus. I've seen CJ talk about it. The Hyksos. So the Hyksos were a Semitic people group, probably not just one ethnicity, but just multiple people groups from Canaan that did settle in Egypt way before the events of Joseph or the Exodus or anything like that. This is the picture on the right here, which is commonly used to describe the multicolored coat of Joseph or whatever, is from 1900 BC, which is way hundreds of years before any of these events would have been relevant. So this is just how Egyptians depicted Hyksos. Hyksos just means foreign kings. So just not from Egypt. They call them Hyksos. We know that the Hyksos were a Semitic people group. Whenever you see Semitic names in Egypt, which CJ alluded to, or statues of Semitic people, they're Hyksos. We know that they're not Hebrews. We've been very aware of this for many, many decades. Whenever the Hyksos were hypothesized to be Hebrews way back from like Josephus, and that's been debunked for like over 100 years now. In fact, here on the left, this is one of the world's leading experts on the Hyksos people, Anna Latifa Murad. She literally wrote the textbook. She analyzes the material culture of the Hyksos people and shows that it is most similar to the northern Levant, like around the Byblos area. So this is like in modern Syria and Lebanon, not from the southern Levant, which is where the Israelites would be at. So it's a completely different Levantine people. They are Semitic speaking. They do have Semitic sounding names. So people get them confused with the Hebrews all the time. But we know that they're not the Hebrews. They predate the Hebrews by several hundred years. They worship Canaanite gods. They don't have any Hebrew traditions. They're not keeping kosher. They're not doing any material things that we would expect a Hebrew to do. They are Canaanite peoples from majoritively northern Levant, not the southern Levant like Israelites. So here's another thing that completely precludes the Exodus. On the left here, we have the Egyptian territory, the Egyptian Empire in the 15th century BC. Notice, it extends through all of Canaan. So, and here we have it on the right, a couple hundred years later in 1279 BC, around the Battle of Kadesh. And you can see it hasn't changed much. In both of these, for hundreds of years, the Egyptians maintained control over Canaan. So the idea that a bunch of Hebrews would have escaped Egypt to go to Canaan makes no sense, because they would have still been under Egyptian rule. The Egyptians would never have lost track of them. They would not have escaped the Egyptian empire. They would have still been well within the Egyptian empire. Like this alone debunks the Exodus. I mean, it's like literally hundreds of years where the Egyptians have pretty direct control over Canaan. And in the Amarna letters, we have all the correspondences to back this up from the period after CJ proposes the Exodus happened. So he's going to have to explain that one, because we literally have leaders in Canaanite cities, including like Jerusalem or Hatzor, which are literally, saying, "Oh, Pharaoh, I'm on my knees. You are my Lord. I'm only in my position because of you." Like, they're obsequious to the Pharaoh. I mean, this is pretty direct evidence that the Pharaoh controlled Canaan. Here we have, sorry if the text is a little bit small on this slide, but this is the conquest of Joshua. So this is after the Exodus, whenever the Israelites are supposed to have entered Canaan and started conquering things. This is probably the thing that debunks the Exodus story the most, because there is no evidence of a conquest by Joshua. So we have a few of the cities here I've listed, but you could do this for almost all the cities, because none of them show a unified conquest. Arad, this one city that was purportedly conquered and destroyed by Joshua, was actually abandoned by this time in the late Bronze Age and only resettled in the 11th century BC. And I have my sources for these here. So there was no walled city for them to conquer and burn at this time. It had been abandoned for hundreds of years by the time of the Exodus. Jericho is similar. It was destroyed around 1550 BC. So like 100 or more years before CJ proposes that the Exodus happened, the Jericho was already destroyed. It was very scantily occupied and didn't have major military walls at the time of the Exodus. And it wouldn't have any walls until the 10th century. So this is according to a 2020 archaeological study of the area. It's like the most up-to-date publishings on Jericho. And it's backed by carbon dating as well for that layer of destruction date. Ai is another one. There's no evidence of there being a settlement in the late Bronze Age on the site of Ai. And Lachish is another one. This one is particularly amusing to me because I have a quote here from Yosef Garfinkel, who is the lead archaeologist at Lachish. And he says, "We know that the destruction of Canaanite tribes was a long process, which took about 100 years. So already not sounding like Joshua's conquest. In the site of Lachish, we found traces of destruction at two levels. One dating back to the end of the 13th century. So this is over 100 years from when CJ proposes the Exodus happened. And another one in the middle of the 12th century. So there's about 50 years between these two destruction events at Lachish, which the Bible in Exodus says that Joshua conquered and destroyed. And the funny thing is that after the first conquering, within that 50-year interregnum, it was rebuilt and inhabited by Canaanites, not Israelites, Canaanites that are worshiping Canaanite gods. Hatzor is probably my favorite because in Exodus, it says that Hatzor was completely destroyed and not rebuilt. But we have Amarna letters from the late 13th century, sorry, we have Amarna letters from the late 14th century before it was destroyed in the late 13th century. And the Amarna letters 227 and 228 clearly have the king of Hatzor begging the king of the pharaoh of Egypt for help and favors. So he's clearly not destroyed. So CJ's date of the 15th century has to be thrown out because of the Amarna letters from the king of Hatzor. Finally, I'll just have a summary here. So we have our 6 points that CJ and I agreed were necessary for the Exodus. So 5 of them, there's no positive evidence for them. And 1 of them, there's evidence directly against it. So there's no positive evidence for a Hebrew culture in Egypt in the Bronze Age. The Hyksos are not the same thing as Hebrews. They're very different. There's no direct evidence of Hebrews in Egypt in any of these large amounts. Also, I want to address the myth that the pyramids were built by Jewish slaves. Absolute nonsense. We know this for a fact. We have the records. We know how much they were paid. We know they were Egyptians. We have their writing inside the pyramids. They were writing in hieroglyphics. They were Egyptian. They had Egyptian names. We literally know some of their names and the names of their work groups. We know that they were not Hebrew slaves that built the pyramids. This is a fact. It's a very common misconception, though. Lots of people mistakenly think this. So the second point was the existence of Moses as a historical figure. Again, we have no evidence to substantiate that. I'm not saying that he wasn't a real guy. I'm not saying that Moses was a myth. I'm just saying we don't have any evidence that he was a real person. Like, there's no Egyptian records of him being in the Pharaoh's house, being a lawgiver in Egypt. We don't have any documents of him being a vizier or any position of power within Egypt. We don't have any historical evidence from the existence of Moses. The 10 plagues of Egypt, similarly, don't have any evidence for. Don't have any evidence for widespread death of cattle, any weird events, any mass graves of firstborns, nothing like that. Nothing, no reference of that. I mean, you think if the firstborn of everyone in Egypt died, then that somebody would have written about that, because that would have been a horribly traumatic event for everyone involved. But nope, we don't hear peep. There's no evidence of the Pharaoh's army being drowned by the Red Sea. We haven't found a big mass grave of soldiers or anything like that.
1 minute.
Cool. We don't have any evidence, archaeological evidence, that over 1 million people spent 40 years wandering around the desert. That would have left a huge mark, not to mention, where are you getting the food and water to feed all these people? So that would literally leave a mark. I mean, for nomadic cultures like the Arabs or the Apaches, we have archaeological evidence of their existence. But this is 1 million people, much more than those like ever. And we find no archaeological evidence in the desert for their existence. And finally, direct evidence against what it says in the book of Exodus is the conquest of Joshua. No evidence to support that. In fact, we have evidence to support the opposite when we actually look at what the archaeology is telling us. I mean, in order for this to be some kind of mistake in the archaeology, and for all of these conquests and destruction to be occurred at the same time, you're not just talking about one mistake. You're talking about a mistake at every single one of these sites, multiple mistakes at each of these sites. I mean, you'd have to be just saying all of modern archaeology is wrong. I'll end it there.
All right, Grayson, that is 15 minutes. And gentlemen, that concludes the 15-minute openings for the Great Exodus debate. So good work to the both of you. We've got lots of points and topics on the table for us to go back and forth on. And so discussion-wise, we'll go about an hour, maybe a little bit more if we need it, because I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity to engage each of the points on both sides, since we don't necessarily have a strict rebuttal round. And so what we'll do is allow CJ to pick the first point or topic that you think would be good to go back and forth on, since Grayson just ended with his opening statement. So CJ, whenever you're ready, pick a point to discuss. And gentlemen, again, the floor is yours. Go ahead. And just make sure to unmute yourself, CJ.
Thank you. So there are, I guess, a couple different things that I would want to mention. So the first point I would want to bring up would be in regards to the Amarna letters. Now, I know there are some who have claimed, like, for example, Dr. David Falk or Inspiring Philosophy have claimed that the how would I put this? The late or early dater of the Exodus is trying to say the Amarna letters are evidence of Joshua's invasion. to be clear, so that I know what I'm responding to, is that what you think the claim for me would be? Okay, cool. So then we don't have to address that element of it. So then the second thing I would want to bring up with the Amarna letters, the Amarna letters describe a chaotic, conflict-rich time between the 1300s, the 1300 and 1400, right? I think they can go farther in either direction, but nevertheless, we'll just say that 100-year period, because I know for sure it's in that 100-year period at least.
It's about 30 years between 1360 and 1330.
There you go. Thank you. And it describes numerous different groups of people warring either against the same group, or sometimes some other groups are seemingly warring against others, right? So that seems to line up very well with what the Bible says is happening at that exact same period of time, which is the period of Judges. It's a tribal history of constant warfare, numerous different disparate groups over time, including but not limited to Canaanites. So my question, I guess, would be, what do you think is the problem for me as somebody who would affirm the Exodus as a historical event from the Amarna letters?
Yeah, Hatzor. In Hatzor, in Exodus or the book of Joshua, it's very explicit. Hatzor gets destroyed completely by Joshua's conquest. And yet in the Amarna letters, we have the king of Hatzor very much alive, very much in control of a city called Hatzor, in correspondence with the Egyptian pharaoh over 100 years after your proposed date for the Exodus in the 15th century.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. So with that, and if you have anything else from the Amarna letters you want to bring in for this, definitely let me know. To reiterate for the audience, I would argue the Amarna letters are a solid evidence of the Judges period, which is what we should expect at that period of time, different groups fighting against each other. But we have a detail here, Hatzor. Are you by chance familiar with the story found in Judges? I believe it's chapter 11 of Deborah and Barak.
No.
Okay. So in this story in Judges, it is said that Joshua and, not Joshua, that Deborah and Barak are fighting against a city that is called Hatzor. So from a biblical perspective, now granted, according to what I said earlier, and I don't want to be inconsistent, these would be two different sources, right? Because unless we're going to assume the Bible is one coherent narrative, which I don't want to do for sake of this argument, that would mean the Judges and the Torah are two different sources. So good and well. But the Judges describes a war taking place in the Judges period, which is when the Amarna letters should be written, right? Describing Israelites fighting against a newly rebuilt Hatzor. So that to me would seem to line up actually rather nicely, because we know there should be, biblically speaking, a Hatzor in existence at that time after the previous Hatzor, which had been destroyed.
So why don't we find any evidence for that destruction of Hatzor then? Like the evidence for the destruction of Hatzor is after the Amarna period.
Yeah, so to be clear, what I'm saying about the Amarna period isn't that that's necessarily, because the Amarna period is shorter than the Judges period, but it's encompassed by it, right? You could almost think of it like in geography, right? Kansas is in America, but America is not all of Kansas, right?
Sure.
So that's what I'm saying.
I do have another question really quick about
Yeah.
the Amarna period being in the same period of Judges, because do you not find it weird that Egypt had like pretty direct control over Canaan for that entire period if the Judges period doesn't seem to mention anything about that? I mean, I'm not sure if there's any reference to Egypt being in control of the region of Canaan during the period of Judges.
Yeah, and so do you mind if, because I do want to answer that, but do you mind if we pin that for just a second while I answer your first question?
Okay.
I'll make sure to write it down here. So Egypt. All right, there we go. So you had brought up how there's evidence of this destruction of Hatzor, which I would say, I think it makes sense that the Amarna letters mention a Hatzor in this Judges period, and then the later destruction taking place around the time of Barak and Deborah, which is roughly, give or take, about 1200 BC. It's kind of hard to date the Judges era because it's not super chronologically precise, but relatively that era. So lines up rather nicely. But you would then have this question you ask, okay, well, what about the evidence of this first Hatzor destruction, if indeed there is supposed to be a first Hatzor destruction? Have you by chance ever heard the argument that there is two different and distinct levels of destruction at the Hatzor site?
No, I have not. From all the archaeological evidence, there's just the one in the late Bronze Age.
Okay, so the Associates for Biblical Research is the source I'm getting. To be clear, there are very many actual PhD historians there. It's not just a bunch of apologists, right? But like Dr. Bryant Wood, Dr. Scott Stripling, etc.
Well, just to be clear, Bryant Wood is is not a very good source.
Well, I know people have claimed that, but I think they claim that, if I can be perfectly frank, I think they claim that because of his position, because as it happens, every historian that has his position is called not particularly trustworthy. So it almost seems like the position itself labels you untrustworthy, which to me kind of just ends up being a little bit irrelevant, if I'm being honest.
To my understanding, he's been largely discredited in the field of archaeology and is not really taken seriously. So,
no, I know. I'm just saying that I think that any archaeologist who is affirming, especially a late date of the Exodus, or an early date of the Exodus, rather, people tend not to take it. I mean, Dr. David Falk has just recently been attacked by like 4 or 5 different PhDs in the last year or two. And I'm not even saying I agree with Falk, but the point there just being that there does seem to be a very legitimate bias against the idea itself, which we'll probably be able to get into later. But nevertheless, so according to here, and I'll just go ahead and quote here from ABR, undoubtedly one of the hottest topics in the field of OT biblical studies in recent years is the dating of the Exodus. Essentially, there are two prevailing positions. The early Exodus view, which contends that the Israelite Exodus transpired during the middle of the 15th century, and the late Exodus view, which purports that the Israelites actually left Egypt nearly 200 years later during the 13th century. On the side of the latter view, biblical archaeologists such as James Hoffmeyer contend that a 13th century BC fits with certain material evidences, in large part due to alleged connections between sites mentioned in the biblical texts, such as the story of the city of Ramses, which he asserts is likely to be equated with the Delta capital. Sorry, trying to run through this quickly. On the other side of the former view, archaeologists such as Bryant Wood argue that the Exodus must have occurred around the middle of the 15th century, based on certain numbers that are present here. Sorry, I got to skip through this so I can get to the actual quote about Hatzor, because this is a big old long article, and I want to find the quote where they discuss the two different and distinct periods of destruction there. Let's see. Hatzor is strategically located at the Grand Trunk Road, which is the main commercial highway that cut through Canaan and was part of the principal military route throughout the late Bronze Age. Thus is at the center of the debate over the time of the Exodus, since it was both destroyed by Joshua and destroyed in the 13th century BC, according to the Bible. The biblical text requires that the former is true, while archaeology requires that the latter is true. The matter that will be discussed here, however, is whether these destructions are distinct or one and the same. This study may go a long way towards determining whether or not the Exodus is, I am still not actually getting to the point. Let me send you the article, because the argument is that they are having two separate destructions. But if I'm just going to waste all my time reading through this to give you the exact quote, I'm going to just...
I think the point is just that the archaeological consensus is not that. So, I mean, sure, we can talk about what a fringe archaeologist says about it, but the people actually excavating the site and studying the site, like in the field of archaeology, don't agree with him on that. So
Bryant Wood, though, is there, and so is ABR. In fact, they've been digging at Shiloh, Hatzor, and Jericho for a couple decades at this point. Arguably, it's the most comprehensive dig in either of those three sites ever.
I would say very much arguably, because I think the only people who are saying that would be Bryant Wood and his ilk. So I don't think anybody else would acknowledge that claim, especially not the people actually doing work. At Jericho, for example, I cited for Lorenzo Negro, who published in 2020 a full, up-to-date, up to 2020 archaeological report about all the excavations at Jericho. And he has a whole section talking about specifically if the results match the book of Exodus, which he said there's no tenable way to match what it says in Exodus to the actual results of the excavations of Jericho. It's very explicit about that. This is the most up-to-date, biggest review of Jericho archaeology.
So, of course, right now I'm speaking specifically of Hatzor, right? I want to get to Jericho here in a minute, but the point that I'm trying to make here with Hatzor is, and you can say that you reject the source, that is fine. I obviously would dispute that, but the point is there is PhD historians and archaeologists doing digs at the site firsthand, who have said there are two distinct destructions of Hatzor.
So what about the history of excavations in this region? Because you would agree that for the first 150 years or more of excavations in this region, it was specifically Christian and Jewish archaeologists who believed the story of the Exodus was real, historical, and happened, and they went there to explicitly try to prove it. And over decades and decades and decades of this, they gradually changed the consensus because of their findings. Now the consensus is no longer that the Exodus is historical, specifically because those past archaeologists failed to be able to find evidence for it.
Yeah, so I would dispute the idea that they had failed. I obviously brought up the ABR thing with Hatzor. Let me get you another one as far as Jericho. So there's actually, to the best of my knowledge, there's been 5 major excavations of Jericho. The first one, which is done by a couple of German gentlemen whose names I always forget, is not very largely discussed, but it did conclude that the city was destroyed when the book of Joshua says it was destroyed. The second is done by John Garstang, who reached the same conclusion. The third is done by Kathleen Kennedy, which overturned that and said that it was actually sometime around, she actually originally said 1400 and then said 1550. So she's a little bit inconsistent in her own work. The fourth being Bryant Woods and ABR's, which again confirms what the other two already said. And then the fifth being the one that you just mentioned, right? So of the 5 historical digs there, 3 of them, including the first 2, actually concluded that there was very sufficient evidence there for the destruction. And there are a couple examples of this, like, for example, with the Haram in the book of Joshua. It's the complete destruction of everything by fire, right? You kill everything that lives, Kol HaNishama, as it says, everything that breathes, right? And then you burn down anything that can't be killed, right? And that's precisely what we see is when we dig that up, is that it was destroyed militarily. After it was destroyed, it was burned by fire. Nothing was looted, which seems to back up what the Bible says. Where
it's just about 100 years too early. That's the thing.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is first off, 3 of the 5 excavations didn't agree with that. And one of the 2 that did affirm that, Kathleen Kennedy's, originally said it was 1400 and then changed, which 1400.
Right, but just to be clear, there's been more studies than just those 5. For example, in 1995, they did radiocarbon dating of the Jericho destruction later and dated it to around 1550. It matches Kenyon's work. And it's funny that you bring up Garstang, because Garstang found an Egyptian scarab in the tombs just north of Jericho that belonged to Amenhotep III, which would have been after the 15th century Exodus date. So again, we're still having Egyptian officials in Jericho after your Exodus date. So it doesn't line up with the 15th century Exodus in Garstang or Kenyon's or the most recent, most in-depth excavations of Jericho. So again, none of these archaeological findings, like the destruction, you might be able to find evidence for destruction in a lot of these cities. It was a very violent time in the Bronze Age, but the destruction was all at different time points. You can't match it all to one big conquest by Joshua. Like, it's statistically pretty impossible to say that archaeologists were wrong at every single one of these cities and they all occurred at the same time, even though individual archaeologists at individual archaeological sites using independent methods all dated them separately.
Yeah, but that's my point, though, is other individual archaeologists have also dated it in the place where I would want it to be, and using various methods, too. So, for example, with Jericho, we have there's of course, the obvious one, which is textual, which would be from the Bible, of course, using it as a historical source, not as a religious source. Then you have what Bryant Wood did, which was through pottery. I did pottery dating by looking at this is the pottery used at this period of time. It was not used in the 1500s. It was gone out of use by the time of the 1300s. It's present there, showing signs of destruction by fire in the 1400s.
But you do realize that mainstream archaeology disagrees with his assertion about that pottery, right? You realize that they say, no, he's wrong about saying that this pottery does not show up in the 1500s. And like, I mean, they just say, I mean, they have evidence to support that Bryant Wood is wrong in his reasoning with the pottery.
No, I would totally affirm that the consensus in the modern day is certainly against me. I just don't really care, to be honest with you. Like it seems to me like because if I had a whole bunch of people come to a consensus that the earth was flat, and I know that this isn't happening, but you would obviously say, well, hang on, there's solid evidence against that. And by the way, there's a long history of people who were experts in this field who disagreed with that, right? That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm saying, okay, I get that there's a modern consensus that tends to buy into Kathleen Kenyon's work. Totally granted. But the majority of the digs that have actually taken place there have gone against her conclusions. She herself revised her conclusions. And one of those digs that happened is currently ongoing, being done by legitimate archaeologists. And the only argument that it seems to be against people like Brian Wood and Scott Stripling and so on, essentially is their conclusions. People are saying, okay, it's not that you're an illegitimate archaeologist. It's not that you're doing pseudo-history.
No, I just rebutted that. They are saying that you are not doing legitimate archaeology. His methods are the problem. I just went over that with the pottery. His actual reasoning in his methodology is what's wrong. It's not just his conclusions. Like, they disagree fundamentally with his process and saying he's not doing real archaeology.
I've not heard a single scholar who's actually, and even if there was one, the fact that I hadn't heard it and have studied this for quite a while would imply they are certainly in the minority. I mean, the pottery is a well-known and well-established method.
Yeah, I'm saying it's just Bryant Wood is not using that method correctly. That's the issue, is that they disagree that he is properly using the method of dating by pottery. Like, he's not using the actual pottery dates as it is recognized in the field. Like, he's not using the method properly. That's what their disagreement is. So I don't know. You want to move on to another topic? We've been on this for a while, but I wanted to ask about, I'm still just, I can't wrap my head around
the Egypt thing, right?
Egyptian control of Canaan during this time. You want to say it's a time of judges, whatever. But like the Egyptians were so in control that they marched an army all the way to Kadesh. You saw that on the map. That's on like the border with the Hittites up in Anatolia. And they marched their army up there to fight the Battle of Kadesh. If it was really, as you're pointing out, that there was all this chaos in Canaan and there were all these rival forces, I mean, they would not be able to maintain their supply lines for that army in Kadesh. They were way far north of Canaan when they were at Kadesh. If they had all these enemy partisans behind their army lines, that would just not have been tenable for their supply lines. So, like, obviously, if they were fronting an entire army force all the way north to Kadesh, they were not worried about any threats coming from Canaan. So there weren't any room for the Hebrews to have been controlling all these Canaanite cities that they conquered during the conquest of Joshua.
So here, actually, there's two things I could appeal to. So the first thing I would appeal to is the Amarna letters. Why would I appeal to that? Because it demonstrates that even though it's true that Egypt had control over this region, it's more of a hegemony than it is an empire. There are independent kings who, while they are under the tributaries, to Egypt, they are not like the same way that a governor would be to a president. Right? They are legitimate kings in their own right, and some of them even rebel against Egypt and say, we're not going to pay you taxes anymore or something along those lines, right? Which, of course, was rather common for that era. So I don't think there would be any issue with the Israelites living there or having control over any of the territory there.
There would be huge issues.
No, because the Canaanites you would already affirm that Canaanites, Amorites, Girgashites, and so on have control over that territory.
Look,
and Egyptians at the same time.
If Joshua and his army started conquering Canaanite cities, who's going to hear about it? The Egyptians. Who's going to come do something about it and protect their vassals? The Egyptians are going to send a fighting force to protect their allies in Canaan. They wouldn't have been able to conquer all and destroy all these cities in Canaan without the Egyptians stopping them.
Well, you know, the Amarna letters ended up never actually getting a response, right? As far as a military response, I mean, they got responses back as far as writing is concerned, correspondence. Yeah. But so then you and I are actually already agreeing, since you just said, yeah, that somebody attacked the Egyptian allies in Canaan, and the Egyptians didn't do anything about it.
I just want to be clear for a second here that there are over 300 different Amarna letters. Some of them ask for like 50 troops. Like, it's not that we know that they didn't receive a military response. I mean, we just don't know about the movements of 50 people. I mean, if you're asking for 50 troops, what kind of archaeological remains do you want for 50 people? If you're talking about the Exodus, that's 600,000 fighting men, probably close to 2 million people in total. We absolutely would expect to see archaeological remains for that size of people. But 50 troops? I mean, how would we know if they did send military backup or not?
Well, because we see that these groups were destroyed, first off, at least a lot of them were, not all of them. And we have the evidence of the conflicts themselves in the archaeological data, such as the destruction of Hatzor, and such as the destruction of Jericho, and such as destructions that take place in Arad. There's obviously disputes about what area actually is Ai. Bryant Wood suggests one, others suggest another. I think there's legitimate arguments that either could work, but that's obviously a little bit of a detailed thing.
Again, this is just Bryant Wood against the world on this one, but okay. If you want to,
well, as far as the potential for a different site for AI, I'll agree with you on that. But with the other ones, I would strongly disagree. I think that Scott Stripling has said the same. I believe his name is Tim Kennedy, has said the same. Something Kennedy, also a PhD. You know, and even people who aren't PhDs, but who are nevertheless historians and archaeologists and Egyptologists, or at least in that field, have suggested things similar. But nevertheless, so it's a foregone conclusion. We are obviously, you don't know anything with Cartesian certainty, but we are quite positive that Akhenaten did not respond to the Amarna letters with force, and that these nations either had to deal with it themselves or ended up falling to whatever military force was attacking them.
I agree that, broadly speaking, the Amarna letters show a decline in Egyptian influence over that 30-year time span. But again, this is far after your proposed date of the Exodus, so they still do have a substantial footprint. This is like 100 years after your proposed date for the Exodus. So,
well, yeah, but of course, the conquest, it's about 50 years, and it also takes place in the middle of the Judges period. But the point that I'm trying to make there is we have evidence, number one, of semi-autonomous rulers in this region. It's more of a hegemony than it is an empire. And we have evidence that these groups, while having conflict with some nations, did not actually get a military response from Egypt. And in fact, there doesn't seem to be much of an Egyptian military presence there until Ramses, which is nearly 150 years after. It's 1274, so we'll say about 125. But so I can just grant that the Egyptians had some hegemonic control over the region at the time of the conquest and also at the time of the Judges, because it doesn't seem to actually mean anything. So we already know they were attacked, and we already know that Akhenaten didn't do anything about it.
So you don't think it's weird that it was never mentioned at all in anywhere in the Bible that the Egyptians had control over Canaan when obviously Joshua's conquests were supposed to have conquered Canaan at this time already, but in reality, we know the Egyptians were in control of it?
Well, again, I think you're skipping over a very crucial point here, right? There is a sense in which both can be true. Let me just give a modern example, because I feel like I'm kind of talking a little bit in a circle here. The Apache lived in Arizona while the United States of America controlled Arizona, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there you go. Both can be true at the same time. It can be true that the people who actually live there and function in their own governmental structure are one group, while another group, a much larger group, also has a form of control.
The issue with that, right, is that in the Amarna letters, they're asking for like 50 troops. Now, if we were talking about some sort of guerrilla warfare occurring with like over 1 million Israelites, I don't think anyone would expect them to ask for 50 troops. What is 50 troops going to do against 600,000 fighting men? Like the numbers just don't work out. Like if you're saying that over 1 million Israelites came into Canaan, conquered many, many cities, and destroyed them, took over a big region of land, and then fought some sort of guerrilla campaign all throughout the Judges periods for the next hundreds of years, like that just stretches the imagination.
Well, so there'll actually be three different things there. The first thing is I'm not going to be tied to the population claims in this particular argument, only because I think that it is granted quite frequently that numbers are exaggerated in many ancient historical resources, but we still can conclude often that the events actually took place. And I'll give two quick examples. Nobody believes that 1 million Persians showed up at Thermopylae, and nobody believes that Thutmose III took 100,000 slaves in his conquest of Libya. But we all agree that the Battle of Thermopylae happened, and we all agree that Thutmose III conquered Libya, right?
Yeah. So here's what distinguishes those from the Exodus, right? One, Exodus is a religious text that lots and lots of people take to be inerrant. I know you said you're not going to be sticking to inerrancy, but like if the Bible was wrong about the numbers, that would be an issue for a lot of the people watching that say that the Bible's word is literal truth. If it's wrong about stuff like the 600,000 fighting men, or it's wrong about the name of the city's Pi Ramses, which it had to have been if your date is true, because it would not have been named Pi Ramses in the 15th century. So if it's getting small details wrong that maybe you say that you're okay with backing off that and saying maybe there were some changes, blah, 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 that's not going to float for a lot of the evangelical people that have a literal reading of the Bible. Every single word needs to be true. That's not the case for Herodotus. That's not the case for a lot of historical texts. Like we can agree that in Alexander's account, like maybe he went to the Siwa Oasis, but while he was there, did he talk to two talking snakes? No, probably not. So we can look at historical documents and analyze them as historical documents, but this is not just a historical document. People literally think that this is the inerrant word of God. So it's inherently different from that perspective. One more point. I know I talked about, but just one more quick one. Both for Thermopylae and for sorry, what was your other example? Thermopylae and
Thutmose III's conquest of
conquest of Libya. Yeah, there is archaeological backing for both of those things. So like there's independent things that we can look at to verify those. There are multiple sources for Thermopylae that aren't just Herodotus, and there's ancient statues commemorating the Battle of Thermopylae. So there are other archaeological things that we can do to corroborate those stories. And that's what I've been trying to do with Exodus all night. And I'm just not seeing the archaeological support for it.
So I think there'd be a couple points there. The first and just the most important one is, I mean, obviously infallibility is a big deal. It would even be a big deal for me because I don't believe the Bible is getting details wrong. The problem is it's just not the subject of the debate, right? Like I can be wrong about my belief in infallibility and right in my belief that the Exodus took place. So we got to separate those things for the purposes of the conversation such that I'm not only would I say I'm not required to, but it wouldn't even make sense for me to want to defend infallibility because it's not the subject of a conversation, right? So if I were an atheist, I could argue exactly as I am right now that the Exodus did actually take place, that these minimum set of facts does need to be true, so on and so forth, right? And there'd be no harm, no foul. Me as a hypothetical atheist and me as I am right now as an evangelical Christian could agree on that if indeed the evidence was true, which of course I think is viable, which I of course think it is. I think the second problem is I just would disagree that there isn't archaeological evidence. I think we've already gone over a couple of the things where I think that there has been solid evidence, at least of the conquest. We haven't gotten to the other stuff quite yet, but of course I think we will. The rejection of that seems to primarily be a rejection of the methods and the sources. But I can just rely, I think, on their evidence, like the fact that the attacks that took place seem to corroborate the attacks that took place in the Bible. The Haram is a very unique method of combat. right? A lot of times people are looting. They're not necessarily burning everything, including the food and the gold and the jewelry and all that other kind of stuff. But we find charred wheat that comes directly after the spring period, which we know it was directly after the spring period because they celebrated a Passover directly before crossing over the Jordan, right? That lines up perfectly with the biblical story. So we would have, in order for us to conclude that Jericho is not attacked by the Israelites, just as one example, on top of rejecting what I think is a legitimate historical source and rejecting what I think are very solid archaeologists who have concluded that this is in fact the case, we would also have to basically say the exact invasion of, at least of Jericho, because that's the one I'm focusing on the moment, that is described in the Bible did happen. It just didn't happen from the hands of the Israelites, which to me stretches credibility. All the details are right except for the army. Well, if we have a historical text that's telling us which army it was, then that seems to indicate to me that the details in the army are going to fit one with another, right?
So you really don't think that it ever happens that there's like the city like Jericho gets destroyed in like 1550, somewhere around there, BC. And everybody who lives there in Canaan knows that Jericho got destroyed a couple hundred years ago. Nobody remembers who it was. But like hundreds of years later, right, in the Iron Age, they finally have a written Hebrew language that they're working on, Proto-Hebrew. They didn't have the ability to write down stories before this. They just had an oral tradition. And they were looking at ruins. They were looking at all these things. And they maybe had a story that Joshua came in and fought with the Canaanites. And now they look around them where they live. They see ruins. They say, yeah, that's where Joshua destroyed that city. And they're just attributing what they see around them to the stories that they know from oral traditions. And then hundreds of years later in the Iron Age, when they finally do develop written Hebrew and they write these stories down for the first time, and it's directed by the class of priests and the monarchy that is obviously trying to make themselves look good, trying to have a unified origin story for their people so that they can rule effectively. You don't think that they're going to draw on all of these ruins around them? They're not going to draw on things that people know, that rumors and stories that have been pervasive throughout their culture. Like, it makes total sense to me why like the priests would be behind this, why the king would want this to be written down the way it was. I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean,
I think my biggest problem with that, honestly, is you can formulate an ad hoc hypothesis, and sometimes ad hoc hypotheses are totally true. But it's kind of like the what's the argument they use? The water in the hole on the ground kind of argument, right? Like, once you already have all the details, you can easily make a hypothetical argument that fits all those details. But that doesn't mean that that's what's necessarily deriving from the details, right? So is that possible? Well, sure, of course it's possible. I don't see any reason to conclude it, though. It just seems like a way to get out of it. You know what I mean?
It's because the archaeological evidence shows us that these cities were either not cities at the time of the late Bronze Age, or were destroyed much before or much after the Exodus. So none of it lines up for a single conquest. That's just the archaeological consensus. So given that data and given what we know about when these stories were first written down at like in Proto-Hebrew or whatever, it just seems to make the most logical sense about when you consider the environment of which these things were written down and the archaeological evidence in the Bronze Age as we know it.
Yeah, and I think the biggest problem we're having there is just that I reject the understanding you're presenting of the archaeological evidence. I think that the evidence suggests, both from guys like Garstang and ABR, that Jericho actually was destroyed when we claim it was, or that Hatzor was destroyed. And I brought up how the Amarna letters seem to line up perfectly with the period of the Judges, or how it seems like there's two different destructions of Hatzor, which is precisely what the Bible talks about, or how 3 of the 5 major excavations in Jericho seem to conclude something similar to the Bible. And I can even give another example of this we haven't talked about quite yet, right? So in your estimation, which of course, I imagine you are getting from, you brought up Abraham Fost earlier, but Israel Finkelstein, I imagine you probably have read, right? Yep. So what is their conclusion as far as when the Israelite culture started to develop?
Like early Iron Age.
So post 1000 BC, right?
Yeah, after the Bronze Age collapse. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but
That's
we
around
know,
the time. That's around the time whenever Egypt lost control of Canaan in the Bronze Age collapse, and there would have been a power vacuum in which it would make sense. There would have been the Philistines would have been located there at that point, which would be a culture for them to develop against. So it makes sense that they're developing their own identities. That the coastal Canaanites are obviously developing their own culture as they go across the waters. This makes sense as a time period for an ethnogenesis event for the Israelite identity.
right. And I appreciate you mentioning that because I've also read those sources, and of course, that is what they conclude. It's also not possible. We have a Merneptah stele that from 1208 BC describes Israel as an already coherent ethnic group over 2 centuries before that ethnogenesis is supposed to have taken place. So, like, what sense would it make for me to say, well, there's no evidence of an America beyond 1850, and America probably had its origin around 1850 to 1870 when we had a Declaration of Independence from 1776, right? It's the same thing going on here. We have undoubted evidence. We know for a fact when it comes from. We know when Merneptah reigned, all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And there's...
So,
go ahead.
I want to say I'm not saying the Merneptah stele is wrong. I mean, that is obviously like the first written evidence for a people called the Israelites, right? That doesn't mean that they were culturally distinct at that point in time. Like archaeologically, materially, we only see Canaanites in that region. We don't see any distinct cultural group. That just because there's a tribe calling themselves Israelites, sure, but materially speaking, we don't see any differences between them and the surrounding Canaanites. So, like,
so I would
seeing them building temples to a monotheistic God. They're still building temples in the Canaanite style. Their pottery is in the Canaanite style. All of their material goods are in the Canaanite style. They're indistinguishable from Canaanites.
So let me give a source that would disagree with that. So William Dever, who is one of the most well-established Israelite historians, what do you call that? Biblical historians, I guess. Anyways, and also not a Christian, I would point out. He's a Reformed Jew, but he doesn't actually believe in God. So he's Reformed Jew in the very lightest of senses. William Dever has said that the Israel mentioned in the Merneptah stele is a cultural and probably political entity, but rather than a fully organized state, a distinct ethnic group. And that's from a book he wrote in 2003, the title of which is, let me go ahead and check here. Come on, really? I have it written here somewhere.
Well, it's not very material anyway, because what he's basing that off of is like the way that the Egyptians have written it on the stele is for a people group. So they're just describing a group of people, a tribe of people.
Well, yeah. So I mean, there you go, right? So it doesn't matter the book that we're, but the point there being, right, that what, and I would completely agree, as with the Bible, by the way, that it's not an organized state, because the organized state doesn't seem to be established until the kingdom of Saul, which is give or take.
It doesn't exactly matter. Here's the crux of it, right? If you're going to say that this was a culturally distinct group of people, then the onus is on you to have evidence for that. So you can point to the way that it's described in the Merneptah stele. Sure, they're describing a group of people that they call Israel, but
that are distinct from the other groups of people.
But we don't see anything in the material culture making them distinct. Again, like in that region in the 1200s, around that time, we don't see any temples. Like the temples that we see are to Canaanite gods. We don't see anyone keeping kosher.
Well, there's only one. See, this is a little bit of, I think, if I may be frank, it's just kind of a misunderstanding of the Israelite culture, because there's only one temple in ancient Israel, and that temple happens to be the site of the holiest site in Judaism and third holiest.
That
site
is so far after the year.
No, I know that's not the point. The point is we don't dig there. Nobody's actually dug under there to find Solomon's temple.
But okay, just real quick, even in your own chronology, they only build that temple with David Okay, so we're talking about before then. If we're talking
Right.
about the
Before then,
Merneptah
it's
Stele.
tabernacle, which is a tent.
Yeah, so
there
then
wouldn't be
we
archaeological
shouldn't
evidence.
find I mean, if they only had the tabernacle, right, then we shouldn't find any temples. But we find in all throughout Canaan, we find Canaanite temples. It's not like there's a big region where there's no Canaanite temples, and are you proposing that's where these nomadic people groups would be? Like, materially, we don't find evidence for a distinct culture at that time. So like we only once we look in the material record, we only start seeing evidence for a distinct culture in the early Iron Age.
Yeah, I just think that there's a couple different problems with that. The first is, as far as the temple is concerned, we just wouldn't, right? If we can't find evidence of a tabernacle because it's a tent and therefore would leave none, and we can't find the temple because the holiest site in Judaism and the third holiest site in Islam is there, and therefore we can't dig there, then there's no reason we would find that evidence. But we would find the other evidences because there's much of it around, and there's no claim, just so we're clear, there's no claim in the Bible that says those temples shouldn't be there. In fact, quite the opposite is true.
So what we actually do find is a transitionary type of temple that's not strictly Canaanite, not strictly Hebrew, but we see it's kind of temple where they're worshiping just one God and his wife. So we see this, it fits
Yahweh
with
and
the Yahwism tradition. So yeah, I mean, we do see things like that are a new culture emerging from Canaanite, where we start to see subtle distinctions from Canaanite culture over the decades compounded, and then we see a smooth transition to Israelite material culture.
Yeah, that the temple
organic in the region.
The temple where we find the Yehovah and his Asherah thing is from like the 700-800s BC, and it's something that that actually itself lines up very well with what the Bible says, because it's painfully clear, and I don't mean painfully clear in the sense that you missed it. I'm just saying that like that's the whole point of the prophets. They're over and over and over saying, you guys have built these temples to high places and all this kind of stuff. And you know, I mean, the oldest of the prophets, according to even secular historians, is probably Hosea from the 700-800s, BC rather, right? So that is, I think, kind of irrelevant to the conversation, right? Because if we're talking about the area in which we're talking, between the 1000s and 1400s BC, we shouldn't expect to see temples, at least not to Yehovah. We should expect to see temples of any other group that's around there, because they have no such requirements. And we know from the Judges, the book of Judges, that according to the biblical narrative, they are still there, albeit significantly weaker. So what would we expect to find?
That's what I was about to ask you. I was about to ask, in your conception, when you think about this, right? This is 1 million Hebrews, or if you disagree on the exact number, a large number of Hebrews. What would you expect to find? Because those people are not just going to leave no trace at all. We would expect to find material remains from these people, both in the Sinai Desert and in Canaan.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's obviously what we've already discussed with the conquest, which I would bring that up again. I think that we would expect to find other groups mentioning them, which with the Merneptah stele we for sure do. There are disputed steles from slightly earlier than that, which there's no real consensus as far as do they actually mention Israel or do they not. Many people would reject it, many people would not. I'm trying to remember the exact name of it, but it's like 1375. And then of course there's other disputes, like are the Shasu actually Hebrews, or so on and so forth, right? So there's for sure the 1208 one, and then potentially even other ones, but admittedly that's not the greatest of evidence because nobody's quite sure, right? We would expect to see a series of wars taking place in that era, both the conquest and the latter Judges period, which takes place over some 300 years. We do find that. We would expect to see certain cities being destroyed in this time. We do find that. We would expect to see holy war specifically in that time, and we do find that, right? Now, as far as things like, okay, but what about like things like keeping kosher and stuff like that? Admittedly, there is a little bit of I think a difficulty in even ascertaining that kind of stuff. because of the fact that there is mixed cultures there, right? So in other words, if you were to find a grave in Israel that dates back to 1200 BC, it's entirely possible that it could be a Canaanite grave because there's no record of strictly Israelites being there. There's your initial conquest, which kind of breaks the city thing and everybody goes tribal. Then there's the 300 years, which is constant tribal conflict. And then it's not really till the 1000s to potentially 1100s BC when you actually have a solidified kingdom there, which in my opinion makes perfect sense of the fact that that's when Israel Finkelstein and these other guys think that an established culture happens. That's when a kingdom takes place, right? But if we're talking about the era which we're actually discussing, the things we would expect to find, evidence of warfare, other people discussing them, so on and so forth, we do find that. It's there, right?
Yeah, but we find that evidence of warfare for hundreds and hundreds of years, 1,000 years before this period. It's like near constant warfare in that region. That's not unique to this period. It's always going on. In fact, what we find is most of the warfare is at the Bronze Age collapse, the same time in the same where the sea peoples are ransacking all over the Mediterranean. So like it's not like the picture you're painting. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but again, the warfare, it's not exclusive to this time period. Literally, warfare throughout the region from like 3000 BC all the way through the Bronze Age. Warfare is pretty constant. The Egyptians, on the other hand, like established pretty firm control over the region in this period you're talking about. When you want to say that it's the period of judges and like all these independent groups are running around, like again, the Battle of Kadesh. I mean, if it was this chaos land, the Egypts, no one in their right mind is going to be fighting over Kadesh. You're going to be fighting over the period, the chaotic borderland. You're not going to go past the chaotic borderland and put your whole army on the other side of that, leaving your capital open, and then like have just no supply chain integrity. Like it just doesn't make sense militarily how the Battle of Kadesh could have occurred if what you're saying is true.
Well, so let me actually just ask you a question. We agree that the Meneptah Stele does discuss the existence of a distinct cultural group called Israel, right?
A tribe of people called Israel, sure.
Okay. Would you also agree that the Egyptian hegemony over Canaan is still in effect when the Meneptah Stele is it's not really penned, but whatever you call the writing of a stele?
It's very much waning to the point at that point. Like in like the 1206 or whatever. I mean, that's just a couple decades up to before the Bronze Age collapse. I don't know. I don't know how thorough their control was at that point in time. And they just say that the Meneptah Stele, the first mention of Israel, is say, I destroyed the people of Israel. So I don't know why the Bible doesn't talk about that. I mean, that seems like huge. If the Israelites got into a giant battle with Egypt, even if they won or lost, it seems like that would at least be mentioned.
Well, I mean, my own personal, of course, not expert theory is just that the Meneptah Stele is kind of full of crap. But that's not uncommon for Egyptian history, right? So that's kind of why I conclude that. But the reason I asked the question is because if the hegemony does still exist, but Israel is present there, then here we have the situation where Israel has control over the land in a sense, and also Egypt has control over the land in a sense. Now, you did just say, okay, but I don't know how strong it is at that time. Fair. Would you agree that the Amarna letters demonstrate to us that there is distinct Canaanite kingdoms, city-states really, existing in the land of Canaan in the 1300s?
It's a little bit it's hard to say that because the people that writing the letters say, I only am in this position of power because the Pharaoh allows it. And of course, they're sucking up to the Pharaoh. It's hard to know how serious to take that. But they're saying, I'm only ruling over this Canaanite city because I was placed here by the Pharaoh. So, like, it seems like pretty direct control, or at least, they're very, very obsequious to the Pharaoh in Egypt. And again, this is like between the time period of like Ramses II like Ramses the Great was like a peak of Egyptian influence in that region. This is like between that. You want to say that the Exodus occurred during the height of Egyptian control over Canaan.
Well, me personally, I take the early date, so 15th
yeah, the 15th century, exactly. So like the Exodus would have occurred like before the peak of Egyptian influence in Canaan. It just doesn't make sense with the Bible story and Judges for Egypt to be a major player in the region at that time and never be mentioned.
Well, as far as militarily in Judges, that's right, but they are mentioned, I think, in as far as being a political vassal in peripheral books, right? Not a political vassal. That's the other way around. They would be the vassals. But like, for example, it talks about, Solomon marrying a daughter of Egypt. Whether or not that actually happened isn't my point, but just the text does demonstrate that the Egyptians seem to have a certain level of influence there at the time. But here's what we now kind of see with the questions I just asked, with the Amarna letters and also with the Merneptah stele. In both eras, which are spread out by nearly 150 years, right, we see Egyptian hegemony for sure, sometimes even stronger than at other times, but also it does seem like there are groups of people living there who do have their own governmental structures. And this is why I keep referring to it as a hegemony and not an empire, right? Do they have hegemonic control over there? Certainly. It's not akin to like what the Romans did, though, where the Roman state was present doing their political thing in Israel or in Egypt or whatever nation they happen to control, right? The Egyptian empire is much, much different than that. It really is largely a hegemony. We have dominant control over here. You're certainly not trading with our enemies, that's for sure. And if you're not giving us our necessary tribute, we're going to have some problems. But really, you're kind of autonomous. Autonomous is, just to be clear, autonomous is not the same.
So what happens when a group of people goes in and starts a major conquest in Canaan, right? That all those vassals are going to be getting the Egyptian overlords to come in and intervene. So Joshua's conquest doesn't make sense if the Egyptians are the hegemon in the region.
But we know from the Amarna letters that at that period of time, they weren't doing that.
But
for whatever reason, I think it has a lot to do with...
This is like during the reign of Thutmose III, who went on like 20 different campaigns and massively was militarily involved in that region, like at the drop of a hat. So it's like they had the resources to mount a full army, like the Battle of Kadesh, the Battle of Megiddo. There's lots of battles of the whole Egyptian army in that region stomping out rebellions. They stomp out a ton of rebellions, but they never mention a rebellion from Joshua, from the Israelites. It's never mentioned in the Bible that the Egyptians came and intervened with the conquest. It's like the Egyptians are totally absent from the story. It's super weird.
Yeah, before this period, the nearest we have a record of military conquest in Egypt is Thutmose III. Now, of course, whether or not you take long chronology or short chronology and then when exactly his reign happened, there's light dispute over that. It's not nearly to the level.
I mean, his mother Hatshepsut also was doing some military conquest in the region, but sure, yeah, so it goes all the way through the military conquest, all the way through Ramses the Great and everything. This is like hundreds of years of Egyptian involvement militarily in the region.
Yeah, so the issue that I'm having with the way you're presenting it is, so we have a major military action by Ahmose in the 1500s. We have major military action by Thutmose III in the 1400s. And then we don't have another major military action in that region until Ramses in the 1200s, specifically 1274 is when he has the Battle of Kadesh, right? Now,
Amenhotep II, didn't he have military campaigns in the region too? Like the guy after Thutmose III?
The guy after Thutmose III is actually, well, let me think. It might be Amenhotep II.
I think that there are other pharaohs that are involved in the region putting down. I mean, if they hadn't been in the region for over 100 years, I don't think that the Amarna letters would have been written to their Lord Sovereign if they hadn't been involved in the region in 100 years. So,
well, and there's certainly an interesting point there. Obviously, I think that there's some examples where something similar to that does happen. The aforementioned Roman Empire has nothing but failed invasions in Britain after Caesar, and yet they
Really
do manage
quickly-
control of that region for 300 years somehow, even
really
though they
quickly,
never.
I wanted to ask Donnie, how much more time do we have in the open discussion left?
So we just hit about the hour-ish mark
Okay.
for the open discussion, but I do want to make sure you both feel like you've had the time and opportunity to discuss each relevant point. So how are we doing on the overall topics, do you think?
I want to ask CJ if he wants to talk about either like the Red Sea part of the story where the Pharaoh's army is lost, or the like pre-existing Hebrew culture before the Exodus in Egypt, any evidence he might have for that, or like I just have a question about like if there were like a million slaves or a huge number of millions of or a huge number of Hebrew slaves that escaped from the Exodus, like the estimates for the population of Egypt at that time in the late Bronze Age are like single digit millions. So this is like a huge chunk of the labor force that would cause like a huge decline in the economy if that many people left in monumental building. And I don't see evidence that there was a huge decline in the economy or agricultural output or monumental building. If they lost that many slaves, why don't they seem to have had any issues from that?
Well, so there's two things I would want to point out there. The first is just again, I don't know about whether or not the actual numbers are necessary for the purposes of our conversation. So we can even say, like for example, the what was his name? Some guy who was on the History Channel is the only reason I know about him, but he suggested like the armies were probably closer to 4,000. If 4,000 is 20% of the overall population, then the overall population is probably closer to 20,000. And that would be 20,000, including men, women, and children, not simply men. So it's a significantly smaller number, right? Now, again, only referencing that because it's possible to hold the position the historical Exodus took place and not be a Christian. Richard Gabriel is his name. Sorry. Richard Gabriel is not a Christian. William Dever is not a Christian, right? A couple of these other guys are not Christians. So that you can bite the bullet on biblical infallibility, even though I wouldn't in another context. You can and still affirm a historical Exodus, right? The second thing, though, is there is actually some interesting, what I would call results. For example, there is a deeply anti-Semitic bent post the era that we post 15th century, and not just simply with Israelites, but with Semites in general. And it doesn't seem to be there before. Now, to be fair, one could say, okay, is it possible that's a result of the Hyksos? And it is. So in a manner of speaking, we could say, okay, non-determinative, it can fit on either one of our models. Fair enough. But it is there, and it would be expected if what I believe about the scripture would be true, right? Second thing, we do have writings that people like Doug Petrovich, who is a PhD, and David Roll, who obviously, I don't want to get into his new chronology, but as far as this particular thing, he is at least an Egyptologist. We do have them claiming that there is evidence of what they would call a proto-Hebrew writing, proto-Sinaitic, I think is what they call it.
Yep.
That we find present in the areas around where the wandering period should be taking place, right? We also find this very bizarre monotheism prop up out of nowhere, or at least henotheism.
Wait, can we pause at that point really quick? I just want to address the proto-Hebrew writing.
Yeah,
so that wasn't just in some random location, right? That was a very far out of the way Egyptian outpost that was like a mine, if I remember right. There was some natural resource that they were mining out there. And they had a temple on site to like an Egyptian goddess Hathor. So like this is very, very unlikely to be from the Exodus. But I agree that there's the Proto-Hebrew writing at that site. It is an Egyptian site, and it does seem like there were like Semitic like workers, laborers at that site writing that Proto-Hebrew. I don't dispute that. the Egyptian temple on that site makes me think it's not at the Exodus. But
well, and so here's where I would say I think that we would have to distinguish between post and pre-Exodus. If I understand correctly, the dating of that mine would put it before the date I have for the Exodus.
I do not think that is correct. I think it's in like the 1200s.
I believe we'll have to double check on that, but I believe it's around the 16th to 19th century. I think it's
absolutely not.
So yeah, I would want to definitely look into that, but I'm fairly certain it is here. Let me look at this right now.
All right. Well, let's see.
Yeah, so here's a reference from Proto-Sinaitic progenitor of the alphabet, Frank Simons. I don't know who that is, so perhaps this isn't a great resource. I don't necessarily know. Somebody in the live chat can double check. He says the principal debate is between an early date around 1850 BC and a late date around 1550 BC. The choice of one or the other date decides whether it is Proto-Sinaitic or Proto-Canaanite, and by extension locates the invention of the alphabet in Egypt or Canaan, respectively. So this would be fairly old, and therefore I would want to say, I think I did actually say earlier, it's around the areas of the wandering. That would actually be false because it would be before the Exodus took place, but it would be at least evidence of a
well,
at least a Semitic culture there.
It doesn't line up just from like the earliest writings, like of Jeroboam II in the Iron Age. This was like hundreds of years after that. They're still writing in Proto-Hebrew back then. So it's like, it doesn't line up with the evolution of like the written language for it to be that old. But maybe as like speaking, like they could have written it in hieroglyphics. That might be what you're talking about. But in terms of actually the developing of like the novel script, that's going to be much later. And like from the, I think the site name starts with an S, but I don't remember it right now. But we don't need to get off track if we're already over time. So let's see.
Well, so let me add my last point here real quick.
Like the existence of Moses, or we had Pi Ramses, the city that obviously would be named for Ramses, which there wasn't any prominent Ramses back in the 15th century. No pharaohs named Ramses by that point. So, yeah, we can go off in a lot of directions. Or Donnie, if we're over time, we can just go to the Q&A as well.
I guess it's up to you, gentlemen. We do have some good audience questions, but I do want to make sure you both feel like the primary issues, at least, that you both brought up in your openings have been discussed and engaged. Just to give you the opportunity, Grayson, and you, CJ, to address anything you'd like to. So I guess it's up to you guys. How do you feel so far about the topics discussed?
I think, and I don't necessarily mean this as a criticism because there was a lot of substance in our conversation. But actually, we didn't deal a lot with the evidence I provided at all. The argument from scripture, argument from tradition, and argument from other historical sources. Archaeology, we did, definitely. But
why don't we do this then, CJ?
How
about we do some bonus minutes? And we'll allow you to pick something specific. So I guess since CJ has the positive case tonight, why don't you feel or pick something that you feel maybe Grayson hasn't addressed? And then we'll allow you guys to go back and forth on it a little bit. And then Grayson, that'll give you a chance to respond too. Let's do that.
Yeah.
CJ, pick something and we'll go back and forth on it.
I'll try to narrow these down to 3 quick bullet points. So the first thing we'll say, I laid out what I called the argument from the Bible, right? First and foremost, do you agree that the Bible is a historically, we'll say relatively, historically reliable text, at least in some places?
I mean, that's a very couched question. I mean, in some places, sure, but as a whole, no. I mean, it describes things like a global flood, the 6-day creation, the Exodus. I don't think, there's just because, it's a famous and overused example, but just because Spider-Man takes place in New York City and we know New York City is a real place, that doesn't mean that Spider-Man is historically reliable. So, yes, there are true cities, true events, described in the Bible in places, but as a whole, I would definitely not say it's historically reliable.
Okay, so let's grant, for the sake of argument, that Genesis 1 through 11 is mythology. Okay, audience, don't worry, I haven't betrayed you. I'm granting it for the sake of
I do think that it's weird that tonight you say that you do believe in biblical inerrancy, but when you specifically want to debate about the Exodus, you're no longer advocating for biblical inerrancy. It seems like you have a softer position when you're actually wanting to get into a debate on these subjects versus your true position if you are a believer that the Bible is infallible.
Well, there is a reason for that, and the reason is that this is not a theological debate, right? I know people treat it as a theological debate sometimes, but I consider this to be a historical archaeological debate. And so I could see there's a hypothetical CJ who believes the Exodus took place and who doesn't believe in God. That's a hypothetical, of course, but the point is that could be, there's nothing inconsistent about that any more than I find an inconsistency in the fact that I believe there was a Trojan War, and this is in real life. I believe there's a Trojan War, and I don't believe in any of the Greek gods. The whole mythology surrounding the Trojan War is complete nonsense.
Right? I mean, I can accept that, like, the mythology and the narrative of the Trojan War is fiction, but based on a kernel of truth of real events. I already said right out the gate that could totally be true for the Exodus. I'm just disagreeing with the Exodus narrative and mythology as it's laid out in the Bible. So, like, I have no problem with, like, over multiple decades, like, many groups of, like, proto-Hebrews, like, leaving Egypt, going to settling Canaan. Maybe there was actually a guy named Moses. I have no problem with any of that stuff. I'm just not seeing the archaeological evidence to support it. That was more so my point. That's why we probably stuck on archaeology so much, because I really do think that this whole thing lives and dies on the archaeological evidence.
So, and with that, sorry, somebody just messaged me about something. I don't even care. With that, I do want to say this is why I brought up this minimum facts thing, right? Because there's an example I used of this when I was discussing Jesus mythicism with Godless Engineer. Saying Santa Claus exists and saying St. Nicholas exists is not the same claim, right? Yeah. Even though Santa Claus is based on the kernel of truth that is St. Nicholas, the story has been doctored to such an extent that saying that Santa Claus exists and saying St. Nicholas exists are not the same thing, right? But saying
I agree, and I like your analogy.
Thank you. Saying St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker, which you may or may not believe in wonders, is the same claim as saying St. Nicholas exists, even though you may not accept the wonders, right? Because at that point, there's enough of the minimum facts there. This is who he was. This is where he was born. This is the era in which he lived. These are the things he did. This is where he was bishop, that kind of thing, right? So you can, and this is why if you were to talk to, say, a modern secular historian who studies church history, he'll tell you that Nicholas, he may even use the phrase Nicholas the Wonder Worker, because that's one of the ways in which he's identified, even though he'll reject the wonders, right? Because there's enough of the minimum facts present there for you to say that individual, even if there's mythologized accounts, did exist, right? So this is why I set up this thing about minimum facts. What are the minimum things we would have to agree on in order for us to say the bare minimum Nicholas the Wonder Worker version of the Exodus happens, and not the Santa Claus version?
And in this debate, I disagreed with each of the 6 facts. Just to summarize real quick, the pre-existing Hebrew culture enslaved in Egypt, I disagreed with. That's the Hyksos, not the Hebrews. Moses existed as a member of the Egyptian household, the Pharaoh's household, and was a lawgiver in Egypt. I haven't seen any evidence for that, so I disagree with that. 10 plagues of Egypt, haven't seen any evidence for that. 40 years in the desert, haven't seen any evidence for that. Conquest of Canaan, I don't think that the archaeological consensus agrees with your interpretation or Bryant Wood's interpretation on the evidence for that. And again, I'm not an archaeologist, so I tend to put some weight on what the experts in the field who are spending thousands of hours studying this conclude. And then, yeah, the Red Sea story, I haven't seen any evidence for that. So I disagree with each of the
No,
6
exactly.
minimal criteria.
And I appreciate that, because that gets, but then now to take that back to this initial point, the first one being, this is why I'm not here defending infallibility per se, because I can accept those minimum facts and not accept biblical infallibility or even theism in general, right? But then secondly, so I was bringing this hypothetical, and I'm going to extend it past 11. Let's say everything from Genesis 1 to Genesis 36 is myth, just in theory. And we'll even agree, for the sake of argument, that everything from Genesis 37 to Genesis 50, which is the whole book, is legend. In other words, highly embellished. Potentially true, but definitely highly embellished, right? Would you be willing to grant that beyond the mythological point there, that is Genesis, that it starts to become more historically accurate? Or would you still take issue with that?
Maybe it could be more based on a kernel of actual events. Like, as you start going on into the Iron Age events, yeah, I think that it's more likely to be describing things that probably, like, events that probably happened in history. But like, the farther back before the Iron Age you go, because it was like written in the Iron Age, so I think it's more likely for it to be describing contemporary events more accurately. I don't think that's a big issue.
Yeah, and we'd have disagreements on dating there, but that's fine for now. I want to try and make this short. So at what point chronologically, or even just textually, would you start to say this moves from largely embellished and inaccurate to an accurate rendition of history? I would assume it's got to be at least by the period of David, right? Because there's a consensus that King David did exist.
Again, I never think that it goes into an accurate rendition of history. I think it gets more accurate, but I would not even say like things in the New Testament are historically reliable. So I'm not going to say that it's historically reliable at any point, but it becomes more accurate the further into the Iron Age you get. I mean, the evidence that we have shows that these things were first written down under the reign of Jeroboam II. So if you want me to give a date range, I'll just say that.
So this is I think rather interesting, because and obviously you trust certain experts, that's perfectly fine, but you were talking about the consensus earlier.
Yeah.
But the consensus of modern historians, the majority of which are not conservative evangelicals, by the way, is that at least by the time of David, the Bible starts to become a mostly accurate history of the Israelite people.
I do not think that that's the consensus. That might be your understanding, but I do not think that's a consensus. And in your previous debate with PhDs who are very much in this topic, when you said that, they disagreed with you.
Well, one of them did. Josh did, but Maggie didn't. So do you think King David existed, right? Would that be correct?
Yeah, I'm agnostic on that. I don't know if I don't think that it's the consensus in archaeology that King David existed. I think that you might be mistaken on that being consensus. But certainly for like King Jeroboam, it's the consensus that was a real historical figure.
Okay.
King Jeroboam II.
So are you aware of, and I don't want to get too much onto this, but are you aware of, like, say, the Teshadan stele that speaks about the house of David ruling over the kingdom of Judah?
Sure, I've heard of that. That doesn't mean that this is the same David, like, who's described in the Bible. Like, to go back to your St. Nicholas and Santa Claus distinction, like, this might be saying, like, okay, the house of David. Whether or not that's King David, as in like the young guy that, had the slingshot with the Philistine, I think that's like a Santa Claus, St. Nick distinction.
See, that does sound kind of odd to me, though, because we know how houses are named. Right, like the house of Windsor is a little bit different because they're named after a place. But what were the house before that? The Plantagenets, right? They're named after people either who came from a certain region like Windsor or who descend from a certain group like Plantagenets, right? Mm-hmm. So the mere existence of a house of David seems to imply that there is an existing David, right? And we know Hezekiah, Jeroboam, prophet Isaiah. We know they exist because we have a historical record of their existence. So I guess my problem here is it seems like we have very good evidence that the Bible is at least mostly historically accurate.
I disagree with that characterization.
Of Israelite history. And then once we get to a certain period, it seems like now we don't want to, and I don't see the reason why. Like, why do we trust the Bible as far as strictly the history? I'm not talking about anything else.
Yeah.
As far as Hezekiah and Isaiah.
Because we don't. That's the thing. Is that at no point would I ever concede that the Bible is mostly historically accurate. At no point. Not in the New Testament, not in the Old Testament. There are kernels of like events described that or like could be based on real events. But that doesn't mean that their descriptions in the Bible are mostly historically accurate. I do not concede that point for any part of the Bible as a whole. You can find maybe individual sentences that like describe places or describe who was king of what. That could be true. I mean, it could be very well the case that King David was a real historical figure. Did it follow the narrative in the Bible? I'm very doubtful of that. So like, again, I would never conceive ever that it's mostly historically accurate. You can find bits and pieces, but not mostly.
Gentlemen,
So, go ahead.
I was going to say maybe we should give Grayson the last word since you started.
I just had it.
Okay, so let's end it there as we just hit roughly the 2-hour mark, and so great discussion, some positive feedback from the chat. People saying this is what they wanted out of this debate.
I see Elon Musk in the chat said, "Let's stone Grayson." So I don't know if we should give these people what they want, though.
I think that's slang for this was an excellent debate. Yeah. I think the word, this debate was stoned. I think that's what the young kids are saying in terms of cool. So Grayson, CJ, great job to the both of you.